All right, welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us for the latest in the series of TAP Network storytelling efforts, the TAP Network Conversations series. This is a series where we get to know some of our colleagues and partners from the TAP Network a little bit better. This week we have on tap for this storytelling initiative, we have our partners from CIVICUS. We have our colleague Marianna Belalba and Tor Hodenfield from CIVICUS, very close partners of the TAP network, one of TAP's founding members back in 2014. So welcome, Tor and Marianna. Just to start things off, if you can just give us a brief overview of the work that CIVICUS does, how you operate, where you operate, and a little bit of background about some of the work that you're doing around SDG 16 and the 2030 agenda more broadly.
Thank you so much for the invitations. CIVICUS is a global alliance of over 10,000 activists and civil society organizations and have a pretty straightforward mission, which is to strengthen citizen actions in civil society throughout the world. We have a global mandate. We have members in over 170 countries, and one of the pillars of our work is the defense of civil freedoms and democratic values. For that, one of the activities is the CIVICUS Monitor, where we track civil space developments globally in an effort to better understand when, how, and why restrictions to civil space happen, and in the advocacy part of it, what are the most effective ways to respond.
Thanks, John, and greetings from New York, and thanks so much for inviting CIVICUS to this conversation. In terms of CIVICUS at the UN in New York, our main goal is to ensure that our members and partners, as Marianna articulated, can access the discussions, the deliberations surrounding the SDGs and other UN mechanisms. Far too often, civil society groups are excluded from those conversations because of their location or their access to resources or otherwise. And CIVICUS's main goal is to ensure that we have a pluralistic, robust dialogue that is informed by civil society groups on the ground who are experiencing the most acute and severe restrictions to their work.
Great, thanks both. So basically CIVICUS works on the civic space issues at the national level, and then also brings that kind of approach to the global level at the UN in New York. Great. And also, I mean, I think around, SDG 16 in particular, SDG 16 has targets 16.10, which focuses on fundamental freedoms, access to information. So obviously, your work on civic space has a lot to do with the wide range of civic freedoms and human rights that 16.10 cover. But just, I mean, taking a look at this past year in particular, with the COVID-19 pandemic, obviously has been a big challenge for many organizations around the world. The work that you talk about on the ground work, and especially around civic freedoms and civic space, a lot of that has been quite a bit of a challenge for a number of colleagues. So I'm curious from your perspective at CIVICUS, what are some of the trends that you've seen over this past year through the pandemic? Some of the challenges that some of your partners have experienced, and then maybe some insights on how some of your colleagues or how you've worked to overcome some of those particular challenges around the pandemic.
Yeah, sure. I think CIVICUS have documented civic space development and restrictions over many years now, and the decline of those conditions. 2020, unfortunately, was not the exception to that. We were all living in unprecedented pandemic, which forced states to react and to pass emergency legislation to save life and protect the health. Those restrictions are allowed under international law, but our documentation shows that too many of governments actually went further the permissible restrictions on international law and kind of used the pandemic as an excuse to further crack down on civic space or further restrict civic freedoms. Our latest analysis, People, Power, Under Attack, that we launched in December 2020, shows that over half of the world population now live in countries where this repressed or closed civic space, meaning that activists or civil society organizations trying to hold governments into accountable or to challenge power are often met with repression, harassment, intimidation, and even target killings. A few trends that we have seen over the past years is the use of emergency legislation to restrict certain rights. One particular trend that we have documented is the enactment or the implementation of the so-called disinformation or fake news legislation. And what we have seen that instead of actually targeting or trying to overcome disinformation, we have seen the criminalization of dissent, or the spread of any type of information who actually challenge the government's handling of the pandemic. We have seen that in over 36 countries where we have documented the enactment of this type of legislation who could potentially actually have repercussions in the years to come. Censorship is another trend that we have seen. This is not a new trend. We have been documenting censorship over the past years, but now under COVID-19, we have seen how governments are further restricting the dissemination of information, blocking sites, or even blocking the publication of any information related to COVID-19. In addition to that, we know that 2019 was the so-called year of protest, so the right to peaceful assembly is a very important one, is the one who have led to most changes or reverses of regressive policies, and is one of the ones that the governments target the most. 2019, again, wasn't the exception. People continue to take to the street. We saw it especially in the US and globally because of the Black Lives Matter protests, and governments respond with often excessive or disproportionate use of force. And one of the main trends that we see is actually the detention of protesters in 2019, one of the main tactics used by governments to further restrict this right, which is, we call it ironic, because we're taking people from the street open airs and putting it in prison in often overcrowded, which could obviously further exacerbate the spread of the virus.
Thanks, John. And just to add that while civil society, as Marianna has just articulated, experienced rather unprecedented levels of restrictions and harassment and persecution during the last 16 months under COVID, civil society simultaneously has played an absolutely essential and critical role in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. Across the world, civil society has played a systematic and elemental role in providing services, access to crucial medical services, health services, educational services, but also accountability for how governments were responding to the COVID pandemic. And I think this year has shown us how crucial civil society is to adjust an equitable society, especially when governments are unable or unwilling to meet their human rights obligations. And I just want to add one thing, which is that while at the same time the importance of civil society has never been clearer, the international community has absolutely failed on their responsibility to develop holistic, effective international cooperation to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. The lack of international solidarity, whether in response to the COVID-19 pandemic or vaccine distribution, has been by any measure dismal. And the lack of coordination at the UN and international level has massively hampered the response to the pandemic, and to be very frank, has cost the lives of tens of thousands of people because of the unwillingness or inability of certain UN member states to effectively come together to address the situation in a mature and globalized fashion.
Great, thanks. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there about, you know, some of those challenges that you've spoken about, and you know, I think one of the things, I mean, when it comes to the COVID-19 pandemic, and particularly thinking about our work together, and like Tor, like you mentioned about the work together at the multilateral level at the UN, I think one of the, you know, one thing that we always come back to, we always say, is that I think the COVID pandemic is one of the, I think it's a test for us. It's a test for the multilateral system to say, and for the SDGs in general, just to say, you know, if we can't effectively leave no one behind when it comes to you know, the response and recovery, and then building resilience from future shocks. If we can't leave no one behind when it comes to a global crisis, the question then becomes, how do we ensure that we leave no one behind when it comes to the SDGs, when it comes to all of the things that governments are expected to deliver? You know, if we can't respond to a crisis in a time of crisis, it's a little bit discouraging for our prospects for leaving no one behind in non-crisis times. But I think one question, one thing that always pops up, a lot of us have been working virtually. I mean, we'll talk about you know, some of the challenges at the national level, and you know, around freedom of assembly and things like that. We'll talk about that in just a second. But thinking about the virtual space, a lot of colleagues in the civil society space have gone completely virtual to coordinate, to you know, effectively organize. I'm curious about your thoughts about you know, how we can more effectively coordinate virtually. Maybe some experiences from the past year from your side in mobilizing some of your members and bringing them together. Maybe just some reflections from the virtual means of engagement, and how maybe we can you know, build upon this going forward, still have, you know, some of the in-country things that we need to do, mobilization, mass mobilization, things like that. But how can we use virtual means of engagement going forward as well, and improve on that?
I can say a few words about that, but Tori, if you want to come into the UN and how that's impact civil society, I think from our perspective, coming into this virtual world have some positive outcomes, because it enables access to meetings and spaces for civil society organizations that sometimes were unable to travel because of cost, visa issue, etc. So we have been able to do advocacy meetings with certain ambassadors or UN representatives with civil society organizations who previously were not able to. The challenge remains for obviously activists on the ground who do not have access to internet or the bandwidth necessary to join this meeting. This challenge, they also experience it physically, because they're also unable to travel to the capital or to get visas. The level of engagement during the UN, or how effective this online session has been, I defer to Tor on that, but in generally accessibility to these spaces has been a positive outcome that we have documented.
Thanks, John. So there isn't, a blanket answer to your question in terms of how has civil society and states responded to the transition to virtual diplomacy and advocacy. There have been some institutions, including the UN Human Rights Council, that have made substantial efforts to ensure that the existing participatory methods are carried over to a virtual space. That can't be said of everybody. You see in New York that an already very restricted environment for civil society, and by restricted, I mean the fact that so few civil society groups have access to the decisions made in the New York UN sphere, has been greatly exacerbated by the pandemic. The UN in New York has not stepped up to the plate in terms of ensuring, as a matter of primacy, the international, regional, and national civil society groups can access decisions, discussions, and debates around arguably one of the most pressing issues since World War II, or at least an issue with the most global ramifications, right? And the great irony is that the UN exists in response to what happened during World War II. And the argument has been made that this is the most global nature catastrophe since then. And what has been the UN's response to the pandemic? They created the UN in 1945 as a response. And now what is it? It's greater exclusion, not more participation. And so the UN absolutely needs to confront how they have handled the pandemic. But most importantly, will the UN as a system learn from the mistakes it made during the pandemic and grow from them, and grow and learn and try to institute more progressive policies that center citizen and civil society voices at the center of all discussions.
Great, thanks, thanks both. I think just speaking on the UN level side of things, I think one of the challenges that we face when it comes to expanding access is that I don't think it's necessarily the fault of the UN itself, the UN system. Obviously, there are many international civil servants who want the same thing that we do, but I think it is, it's a product of the system that's been built where even just a few governments can step in and say, no, we don't want greater access, and that supersedes a more democratic approach where maybe the vast majority of countries do want to improve access and want to improve the system to be more inclusive and accessible. But I think we have a system that allows for a few powerful countries, and in this case, a few countries that have an incentive or a desire to close the space to dominate the conversation and the approach overall. So I do agree that the system allows for those countries to unfortunately step in and restrict that space. But I think this actually is a great segue to talking about the CIVICUS Monitor. Obviously, the CIVICUS Monitor is a great tool for civil society, by civil society, that CIVICUS maintains. So maybe I won't talk too much about it. I'll hand it over to Marianna, who's the expert. If you can, Marianna, give us a little bit of information about the CIVICUS Monitor, what it is, how you've put it together as CIVICUS and with your partners, and maybe some of the what you see as the added value of something like the CIVICUS Monitor when it comes to the SDGs or to accountability for the SDGs.
Sure. I see the CIVICUS Monitor as probably the culmination of many years of CIVICUS research on civic space and the lessons that we learned to arrive to the monitor. The monitor was the product of over 2 years of consultation with civil society. So it is a research tool that it was built by civil society for civil society to better advocate in campaign for civic space. A few things that we were thinking about when creating in the monitor, it was that the voices of civil society has to be at the center of our methodology. It is a global tool who have global trends, but the voices of national activists and civil society are at the center of everything that we do. But also we wanted to build a platform that was dynamic. We didn't want an annual report who will get out of date very easily. We wanted that the monitor to kind of respond to the events that were happening on the ground. So we basically built a methodology that kind of combines quantitative data in qualitative data. So that is a perfect mix between the ratings, kind of give you, you know, an indication of the health of civic space in a particular country, and the ratings offers a comparability over time also between countries. So that is a good component to have, whether civic space has been declining or improving. And now we can provide evidence of that, but also qualitative information, right? There is a little bit more nuance and complexity on the civic space condition in a particular country. So that's why we build the qualitative information on that. At the heart of the monitor are our research partners. I think CIVICUS, as a member-based organization, doesn't do anything if it's not in alliance with activists and civil society organizations. So the data that fits the monitor comes from regional organizations who partner with CIVICUS to kind of keep the monitor live. Basically, it is a tool to have evidence of when and how civic space has been restricted, and hopefully to better advocate and open up spaces for activists and civil society organizations.
Great, thanks a lot, Marianna. And I think you know, your point about you know, complementing the quantitative data with the qualitative data, the real live lived experiences of colleagues actually experiencing either restrictions or open civic space and freedoms. I think that's something that we often overlook when it comes to measuring civic space or just measurement in general for SDG issues and around SDG 16 in particular. And I think just a follow-up question to this, you know, we hear from governments, we hear from, you know, national statistical offices, you know, we get this response from them when we talk about qualitative data that you know, it doesn't necessarily line up or match with the quantitative data, or that it's not as robust or useful as the quantitative data. But I think just from our experience in working with that, with quantitative and qualitative data, especially around issues around civic freedoms, where, you know, you mentioned before, you know, we live in the era of fake news, and where a government can just say, you know, this is fake news, it's not real, and therefore we're not going to do anything about it. So what do you say in response to those colleagues that say that qualitative data isn't as robust as quantitative data and therefore not as useful? And then what do we do to kind of break that narrative, to make sure that the qualitative data and the lived experiences, these experiences that our colleagues are sharing, can make its way to the government and be seen as legitimate, and make its way into the international level, you know, maybe as well. A question for you, Tor. How do we make sure that that's legitimized at the international level too?
Yeah, I think qualitative data is essential in any measure, especially on civic space issues, which are so complex. Obviously, quantitative data can give you an indication of the quality of civic space, of the healthiness of that, but it is the qualitative data who more directly come from people on the ground, as you mentioned, the ones who actually are experiencing these restrictions. I don't see them as one or the other. I think they're both equally important for having a fair assessment of what are the conditions for civil society. In our case, qualitative data has been essentially in keeping the monitor running with the latest information, but also to kind of adding the nuance of what are the restrictions that certain countries are experiencing. I don't think you can ever have effective advocacy if you don't understand the context, the history of one particular country. One thing that we always get asked when comparing countries, and I think could be the problem of quantitative data, we never wanted to rank countries because I think the advocacy just gets stuck there. You are in the top 5 or the worst 10, and then you don't know why. Many countries in the CIVICUS Monitor are rated the same, but the condition for civil society could be vastly different. Venezuela and Colombia are one example. They're both rated at repressed, but without the qualitative data that we have, you don't understand why. They are countries with a different history. One conflict zones in Venezuela with a weakness of political institutions for over a decade. Many of the close countries, it could be like North Korea or China, who have a very particular way of restricting civil space, and you also have other close countries that are close because of there is a conflict zone or there is a war, or for example, Iraq. So there are the qualitative data that we have give a lot of detailed nuance and context. Without that, we could never have a fair assessment of what are the civil space conditions in a particular country.
Thanks, John. And just to clarify, the implication was that no, there are many civil society advocates and allies within the UN system. The staff of the UN absolutely are supportive of a more participatory approach. But I do just want to say that while there are obviously states in the UN system that are more powerful than others, this phenomenon of restrictive civic space is a global issue. I mean, if you look at the CIVICUS Monitor data, 87% of the world's population live in countries that are closed, repressed, or obstructed. So the vast majority of the world's population now live in national environments where their governments do not respect people's right to express themselves and dissent and to mobilize publicly. So there are states with more power at the UN, but unfortunately, this affliction of denying people their rights to speak on behalf of themselves and to air their grievances is a global phenomenon. And this issue is only increasing. As Marianna said, the number of folks who live under a restricted civic space environment has grown by 4% since last year. So not only is it a global phenomenon that afflicts the vast majority of the world's population, but the issue is getting more and more severe. And so we fully recognize that there are some states that have more power at the UN to make these decisions about access. Unfortunately, at the national level, to be very frank, most countries in the world also take undue and arbitrary decisions to restrict their own citizens' rights to speak out. And that carries over to the UN through a number of decisions.
Yeah, that's a great point. And this is a great segue to another question that I had about, in practical terms, when we identify where a country is repressed or restricted, what do we actually do? Like, what are some of the things that, from your experiences with CIVICUS, of supporting colleagues in these countries where they are actively repressed, where in some cases they're arrested or detained just for speaking their mind, or in some cases even worse, murdered in some cases? What do we do in cases like this where we obviously don't want to jeopardize the safety of colleagues in these countries, but still also need to push back and mobilize in these countries to ensure that these spaces are at the very least not further restricted, but ideally opened up. So I'm curious about your experiences with colleagues, with some of your partners in some of these countries. What kinds of approaches can we take, whether it's as the international community or as advice for maybe an organization in a repressed country? What are your suggestions for some of these colleagues and suggestions for how we tackle these more problematic countries?
You probably will have to edit this part. I was going to say, Tor, you want to comment on this one? It's a little bit more advocacy oriented.
So Civicus does not pretend to have the answer to this question. And I think the most important thing to recognize is that change in the democratic civic space environment in any country has to come from within, right? The UN itself, Civicus, any other international organization cannot change the environment for civic space in a country. It has to come from within. But we do have to acknowledge as well that in terms of our global aspirations and our loftiest ideals as exemplified by the SDGs, we will not achieve the SDGs if civil society is not included in the realization of goals 1 through 17. It's just not possible. If governments cannot simultaneously suppress civil society and then expect to achieve the SDGs, it's untenable and will not happen. But I think that we also have to recognize, and crucially, that because of the restrictions on civil society that we're seeing across the world that are now endemic and more severe than ever, protest movements have become one of the most effective ways to A, air a grievance, and B, to change policy or a regime. We have seen more mass movements in the last 20 years than ever before in history, and they're more successful than ever. I mean, we've seen in 2019, and even during the pandemic, scores of dictatorial regimes who are responsible for the killing and massacring and torturing of their citizens overthrown by people being brave enough to go into the streets and risk their own lives in solidarity for the oppressed. And while civil society, as we envisage it as an organization, as an advocacy group, is incredibly important to protect, we also have to recognize that the main source of power through civil society increasingly comes through protest movements. Then we need to start thinking about, as the UN, as the TAP network, as Civicus, what does it mean to support the exercise of freedom of assembly across the world? What does it mean to support protest movements? And what does it mean to ensure that protest movements don't have to go on the street and have their members be killed or shot or arrested for them to be heard? And how can we include them in conversations, including at the UN, that historically exclude unregistered, less organized social and civil society movements like protest movements?
Yeah, I mean, those are really great points. And I think one thing that we've also seen over the past handful of years or so, but even further beyond that, is that I think oftentimes we see this the issue of civic space as a repressed or open society. And the Civicus Monitor does a great job at taking a look at that and drawing those distinctions. But to Marianna's point, there are absolutely some nuances to this. And I think a classic example of this was, I think, in the case of the US, for example, over the past handful of years, where, the US, we had often seen as a champion of civic space and human rights in many ways. Obviously not without some shortcomings over the years, but in general, as a strong advocate and a champion. And obviously, the previous 4 years under the past administration, we ended up on the other side of things in so many ways. So I think this has also shown us that no country is immune to this. And I think one of the things that we also need to think about is, even in these countries where, we might consider to be open and free and, inclusive and, civic space is thriving, thinking about, some of the lessons that we can learn in good times, that we can protect that space. Because I think the tendency when times are good is somewhat of complacency. I think as civil society, I think one of the challenges, or maybe one of the shortcomings of how we work as civil society, and the same is true for the international and multilateral system, is that I think we often respond to crises better than we do, the more slow burning things or in better times. It's a lot more easy. There's a clear and present danger when there's a crisis in front of us. And as civil society, I think we mobilize a little bit better when there's a crisis. So I think the CIVICUS Monitor is a really great opportunity, as you said, Marianna, a great platform for us to share the stories and experiences of colleagues from free and open societies, from colleagues that are experiencing, repression and persecution, and share those stories with the international community and to learn from one another. And I think that in particular is a really great opportunity. I think there needs to be more investment, including from donors in this space, to be able to bring these colleagues together and share their experiences and learn from one another. Because it's one thing to provide a platform to share information, which is fantastic, but to bring these colleagues together in a meaningful way to learn from one another is also, I think, a major gap for us, particularly when it comes to the international level. But I think one kind of final question for each of you. I mean, we've talked a bit about the national level experiences and how we bring that to the forefront, including through the CIVICUS Monitor. But we have coming up soon, we have the 2021 High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development. This is the forum that we convene every year to talk about the SDGs, talk about progress. SDG 16 in particular is under review at this year's HLPF, so of particular importance to us, those of us that work on SDG 16 plus. So I'm curious, from CIVICUS perspective, what are some of the key messages that you'll bring to the HLPF? Obviously there's a lot with the COVID pandemic. There's a lot of the challenges with civic space that we've just talked about. But if you could summarize, briefly, what are some of the key things that you think needs to happen, either at the national level or international level, that we can bring to the HLPF and kind of mobilize around collectively? What are your key messages that you'll be bringing to the HLPF?
Thanks, John. Just to be clear, we firmly agree with the idea of mainstreaming Goal 16 in every HLPF. As I said before, achieving any of the SDGs is absolutely critical that SDG 16 is protected and promoted as an issue of paramount importance. And it's a cross-cutting issue that continues to backslide on, right? I mean, the issues that we are not seeing progress on this issue. On the contrary, as Marianna articulated, the environment for civil society is worse than it was last year and worse than it was the year before. And so the HLPF, I think, has to have a very frank conversation about why there is the continued backsliding. We are not on track to meet many of the indicators of Goal 16. And there needs to be a frank assessment, political, social, economic, about why this is happening and what the role of all stakeholders are collectively in addressing this issue. I mean, we're already 5-6 years into this process of the SDGs. And we are not hitting the markers on the vast majority of the SDGs. Let's be frank. So when do we start having an honest conversation about why it's not happening for all of them, for the vast majority of the goals, why we're not meeting our targets? And are we gonna just have that conversation 3 years before the end of the SDGs? When do we get serious about talking about our failings, but also, as you said, highlighting the positive contributions that have been made? What is working and why is it working? What isn't working and why is it not? And until the UN is really serious about having that conversation, I mean member states, of course, it'll be very, very hard to, the piecemeal approach of looking at discrete elements of civic space are very important to highlight in the developments and trends. But until we have that frank conversation collectively, I'm hard pressed to think that there will be a substantial change in the lived experience of activists and civil society on the ground.
Great, thanks, Tor. Any thoughts from your end, Marianna? What are some of the key messages that you might bring from colleagues working at the national level or experiences from the CIVICUS Monitor?
Sure. Just to echo what Tor has said, for us, documenting on a daily basis civic space restrictions, but also, I think Tor mentioned this at the beginning, was the importance or the role of civil society during the pandemic, but before, and how fundamental it has been. Just to reinforce that message that civil society, it is at the center of the major contribution, filling the gaps by governments and private companies, and without civil society, there is no way, and I don't know how many times we have to repeat this, that we will ever achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And the context which civil society is operating now is extremely challenging. So if we don't start talking about that, we'll end up in a few years' time regretting or asking ourselves why it come that we didn't actually met that target.
Great, thanks to both of you. I mean, there are many issues when it comes to the HLPF, and I think we've talked about just a couple of them. Tor had mentioned, some of the shortcomings of what the HLPF is, where we're not able to have a very frank discussion, where governments often come to, promote the good things that they're doing, but not necessarily being as honest about some of the challenges or shortcomings where progress may be particularly slow or lagging. And then from there, actually having a frank discussion about, okay, yeah, what needs to happen? You need to be honest with where we are first before we're able to say, okay, we have a gap or a shortcoming here. Here's how we're going to address it. So I do think that there's obviously an ongoing conversation about how we address this at the international level. If it's not through the HLPF, how else can we do that? And I think, again, CIVICUS, the CIVICUS Monitor is another great example of a platform where we can start to have some of those conversations, even if it's within civil society, just on our own side of things, where we can start to identify those trends, start to have some of those conversations, and then hopefully bring that to governments and in whatever form or fashion that takes. We'll have to obviously spur governments into action, and maybe the HLPF isn't the best way to do that. Maybe we think about other ways, but that's obviously a conversation for another time. But just wanted to take a quick moment to thank you both once again for joining us. This has been a really great conversation. There are many things that we could unpack a lot further. We could, I'm sure, talk for hours on this, but I hope that this is a great primer and an introduction to Civicus for colleagues, within the TAP network or broader civil society working around these issues or looking to learn more about the issues that Civicus works on. You can find much more information on the Civicus website and on the Civicus Monitor. So we would encourage all of you to check out their websites and also reach out to Tor and Marianna as well. Again, thanks to all of you for joining this conversation. We would, of course, encourage those that are not currently TAP members or TAP partners to join the network. There's a lot more than what we've just previewed, around SDG 16, around the HLPF, around a wide range of SDG accountability issues. So we hope that for colleagues that aren't already members or partners, that you'll also join us in that journey as well. But thanks again, Marianna and Tor, and thanks again to everyone for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, John. Thank you, TAP. Much obliged.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.